I have the BERNINA Q16 long arm. I was about to retire, and I just started quilting in 2022. And I'd finished these quilt tops, and I'd have to take them to a quilt store to have them quilted, and it was running me $150, $200 each time. And as I was thinking about retirement, I thought, well, wouldn't it be nice to be able to do it from beginning to end? Piece it, quilt it, and bind it. So I went out and bought a long arm. Actually, I looked around and couldn't really find anything, and I came into this store, Quilter's Quest, and they had one for sale. I would say that when I first got the machine, I was overwhelmed. It sat in my basement probably for 3 or 4 weeks before I actually went down to do anything with it, because it's a lot. Well, I have a computer background, and I felt like I could master this machine. What I love about it is its ease of use. The manual is easy to follow, and I can find everything that I need. I have the Q-matic, and the information is available in words or in pictures, and so that makes it really nice. The quilt that I made behind me is made with African prints. The majority of the quilts that I make are made with African prints. And I like to use African prints for 2 reasons. One, it represents who I am, but they come in such different colors. It allows me to start matching colors that I would have never thought to put together. This particular quilt has the blues and the greens, the olive greens, the golds and the browns. It is a Bella Rosa design. The pattern is called Twisted, and I made it for my ex-husband. I have a quilt, again, made out of African prints, one of the Bella Rosa designs. And the pattern that they called it was one thing, but I call it Einstein. The African print looks like it has mathematical signs in it, plus signs, percent signs, and things of that nature. And so I bought other fabrics with numbers on it. And I call it Einstein because when I was growing up, my grandfather gave us nicknames. My nickname was Einstein. I didn't know who Einstein was, but apparently Papa thought I was smart. So every time I have an opportunity to make something that reminds me of my grandfather, I do that, and this quilt reminds me, one of the quilts that I have reminds me of my grandfather. I've been sewing for over 40 years. Started off sewing, making my own clothes. Growing up, I was very small and very tall. So if anything fit, it was too short. And if it was long enough, it was too big. That's what made me start sewing. As I had my children, I started making clothes for them. I would make them Christmas pajamas and house coats that would match. And then I put my sewing machine up for a couple of years. But when COVID happened, I wanted to do something that helped. So I pulled my sewing machine out to make masks. And during the COVID period, there was a lot of racial unrest, social unrest. So all of my masks were made out of African print. And I gave them away. I made over 2,000 masks. As I was making the mask, I felt like I missed the sewing and decided that I wanted to go back to sewing. But I didn't want to make clothes. I wanted to try something different. That's how I got into the quilting. What's next for me? From a quilting standpoint, if you call my house any day of the week, you'll find me in my sewing room. I changed a bedroom into a sewing room, and whenever somebody calls, that's what I'm doing. I'm sewing. I love sewing. I'm headed out to the International Quilt Conference in Houston in a week or so. I'm looking forward to retreats. I've joined a guild here in the area, and they do a lot of community work, a lot of community service where we make quilts and other things that we give away to community. I just did a quilt of valor that we did for some veterans. So the rest of my years will be quilting. One of my goals is to make sure that every household in my family has a quilt. I want to be able to leave a legacy to the family. I didn't realize the importance of community in quilting. As I've made quilts and given them to family or made quilts, I was making a smaller version of every quilt that I made so I would have it for myself. I did a little event at my church to find out that that smaller quilt could be used for someone in a wheelchair who's going to dialysis. So one of the neighbors wanted to buy the little quilt. She decided not to buy it, but I decided to gift it to her husband. He was so excited. He couldn't wait to go to his next dialysis because everyone who came had these beautiful quilts and different things. Now he had one. I'm excited because we're going to start this ministry called So Grateful, which will allow us to come together as a community, get to know one another, teach a new skill, and provide a service to our community, providing these lap quilts for those that are in wheelchairs, baby quilts, and things of that nature. So I'm excited to start that ministry in November. So I had not heard of Quilts of Valor, and my son-in-law is Army. And during COVID, he had to go and serve. My daughter had just had her baby. We call him our COVID baby. He was born March 16th of 2020. And her husband had to leave for a full year when the baby was born. When he came home, I decided I wanted to do something for him. And so I made him a quilt with red, white, and blue. It was absolutely beautiful. He loved it. Then I heard about Quilts of Valor. And the Guild decided that we would make 50 Quilts of Valor and give them to veterans in the community. So I agreed to make 2, and we just presented 2 of them to veterans in my church this past Sunday. They were surprised, they were not aware, but it's an opportunity to let them know that we appreciate the service that they provided to us. Well, my first dream is to be able to get the colors right? You know, you go out and you pick these colors, you put a quilt together, and it doesn't always pop like you want it to. So I really want to perfect color. I want to be able to move from the big blocks. I consider the quilt behind me one with big blocks to smaller, more intricate blocks. And I want to be able to personalize so that the quilts reflect the African community also. To have the opportunity to speak about it. I love the guild that I'm in, so nobody uses African prints, but they're very welcoming of what I do and how I do it. To your point, every quilt shop has a different personality, right? And I even thought about opening up a quilt shop and featuring African prints, you know? But the African prints are a different type of fabric to work with. I go to a quilt shop in the city of Chicago, an African shop in the city of Chicago. All of these fabrics come from Mali and Ghana. And so I get them home and the first thing I do is wash them. I wash them, I iron them, I fold them, and then I start taking them one by one and deciding what colors to go with. The quilt behind me, I pulled out all of the colors that are not primary, but I use this same African print and made a quilt with just browns and gold. And it turned out beautiful. And you can't really tell it's the same African fabric, but it's the same fabric. These are the African cotton fabrics, but we also have the mud cloth, which is a heavier fabric. I haven't made anything with the mud cloth yet, but that is on my list of things to do, to be able to pull it all in and show creativity with the different fabrics from around the world. So the grain of the fabric on the African prints, it's off, it's never straight. I'm always cutting and recutting to make sure I line it up perfectly. When it washes well and it irons well. You know, I don't use starch or anything on it. It irons very well, but it's never straight, it's always off grain. So when I'm making my quilts, especially the quilts that I'm making for family members, it gives me a sense of pride to be able to know that I'm leaving a legacy. I'm putting labels on the back of the prints with love, with scripture, to let them know that this is something that they can pass down generation over generation. So I pick the fabrics based on the person or what I think they might like. I put the piece together. And then when I go down and I put it on the machine, on the long arm, on my Q16, I'm laying it out, batting and all, trying to figure out what quilt pattern I want to use. And I'm looking for quilt patterns that also speak to the African American experience. So I want to do something different and give them something that's meaningful to them. I do a lot of genealogy, and I went back and created a family book for my grandmother. My grandmother is 98 years old. And so we took that and we were able to go back 6 to 7 generations and get great-great-grandmothers, great-great-grandfathers. And then we pulled it forward and did all of the descendants. So each household is represented in this book with a special message to my grandmother. We printed multiple copies and gave every household a copy of this leather-bound book of who they are and where they came from. And now we'll follow this up with a quilt for every household.